All right, we'll reconvene the meeting at this time. Yes, please. Just,
All right, so the other item today for the town board is to consider the first draft of a non-metallic mine operator's license. And I'll give some background as to why this might be a tool. We've talked about it all a little bit before, but a little bit of background. There's been a pretty consistent, I think, position of the board members and certainly members of the public who are engaged in this the Coulee mine issue, permit application, that the town should reevaluate what tools it has to control future non-metallic mining in the town. And the town's zoning ordinance is very limited in terms of what it allows the town to do. It was largely drafted to just let the town make a decision based on whether it wanted or didn't want a non-metallic mine, and then state law changed last legislative session. And it really took away a lot of the authority of local units of government to use their own discretion when issuing a conditional use permit. And so my recommendation, and I think the town board has indicated a number of times in comments in these meetings that they would like to review that zoning ordinance for the future, so that the next application that comes in, maybe the town can be more empowered. I don't know that is not a slow, that is a slow process, okay? And it implicates the entire zoning ordinance, which isn't just about non-metallic mining. And so one of the things the town can consider doing is, which is much quicker, is to put into place a licensing ordinance. And if it does so, that can sit as an additional layer of regulation for non-metallic mining while the town works through its rezone. And there's completely separate authorities. The town has the authority to zone because the county has basically allowed it. A town doesn't have to ask the county for permission to do a licensing ordinance. And the process can be more quick than creating or modifying a zoning ordinance. So the town asked me to draft this ordinance. What I've done is, and all of you should have been sent a copy, what I've done is I've drafted this with a lot of blanks, and those blanks were highlighted, because what you have to decide is how you want to fill in those blanks, okay? For instance, on the very first page, on the applicability section, when we write these ordinances, we typically only apply them to non-metallic mines that would, this includes gravel pits, quarries, not just sand mines, that would process or transport more than 50,000 cubic yards in a year. I once had someone explain about what that amount was, and it's a football field 8 feet deep or something like that. So it's not nothing, but it's a smaller amount. Or maybe it was a hockey rink 8 feet deep, but just in perspective. The point there is that typically what you do is you don't necessarily apply these licensing ordinances to every small pit, because then you're here having to do a license issuance and approval on things that maybe aren't as big of a concern. But the town can decide what those numbers should be moving forward. I'm going to work through some of these other blanks or some of these other highlighted provisions in here to start this discussion. There's an applicability clause on page 2. And one of the things, it doesn't apply to, excavation or grading you're doing for farm use, doesn't apply for construction work, for, if it's really, if the purpose isn't to extract non-metallic minerals, but to maybe move them out of the way to put a basement in, that sort of thing, that doesn't apply. Non-metallic mining at sites where less than X number of acres, total affected acreage occurs over the life of the mine. Again, getting at the smaller pit, not wanting to have to necessarily do that if you're gonna have a little borrow site or something like that. Doesn't apply to the metallic mining, that's not non-metallic mining. And then any kind of removal of a commodity like commercial sod, agricultural crops, or something where you're gonna have, believe it or not, you have to write that in there, or sometimes you'll get arguments that that's non-metallic mining. So obviously a lot of dirt comes with sod. You're taking out a lot of mineral, and you're intending to keep it alive. So take a close look at that applicability section and think about those as exclusions, and then also from the first page, just generally the total amount that you want to apply these to. There's a number of definitions. The 7th definition is neighboring landowner, and that's an important definition later in this document, because it'll be the properties that are subject to a lot of the kinds of protections that we would build into this. The ordinance obviously requires a license. The first question under the license description is the period of time that a license would be, how long a license the term would last. I think when you're trying to, it kind of depends on what kind of a indication you want, what kind of a welcome mat you want to put out to non-metallic mining. If you'd prefer that people don't look at your town as a favorable place to mine, you put a shorter period of time in that, so they'd have to be coming for renewals pretty frequently. If you really want to use the license document to issue licenses and don't want to be sitting here having meetings about every mine that comes in the future, you'd put a longer period of time in 3, 5, 10 years. On page 5, there's a larger highlighted section about existing facilities. You always want to deal with existing facilities, even though I would argue that the town is probably precluded from applying this kind of a license to an existing actual operating or previously approved mine. And it certainly in this case, for instance, wouldn't apply to Coulee. The Coulee mine is not only would we be limited most likely in applying this to the Coulee mine, the developer agreement specifically states that further enactments of this type would not apply, or changes to zoning would not apply.
So it wouldn't apply to the current pits that are in
Current, right, and so the reason why it's still important is because you have to define what you mean by a current pit, right? So if there's a pit, I know you live close to one, Greg, if there's a pit where there's material there, but it hasn't been operating for a while, a lot of times what we'll do is we'll say, if it hasn't been operating for 5 years or something like that, then they've got to come get a license. I think we could better defend that if someone challenged whether we could apply this new law to an old pit. If they're not operating it under general grandfathering and non-conforming legal doctrines, we think
we can set the term then.
and you're going to set the term, right? And to some extent, it's especially important for, how many quarries and pits did you say we have in the town?
We have 27.
So there's a large number
27, I believe.
of non-reclaimed spots around the town, right? And largely those remain because they're not subject to the laws that Coulee's subject to. They're not subject to the reclamation law, and people just let them go fallow. So those are the ones that it's really important to deal with in this context, right? In many respects, what you end up doing is creating a reclamation requirement that you can apply to these old mines that don't otherwise have reclamation. So if they want to go, anyway, we have to really pay close attention to that. as to which ones you want it to apply to and which ones you don't. You know, you could say if there's in this particular town, you could say it doesn't apply to a town that has previously received a conditional use, doesn't apply to a mine that has previously received a conditional use permit, and that has a county reclamation plan, you know, something like that, so you know the town's already approved it, and they're going to have to reclaim, and there's a bond that covers that should they be unable to. So that's a good place to draw the line when you've got a town that has zoning and has issued conditional use permits. But tonight's not necessarily for those decisions, it's for discussion of these things, but just for you all to know. Okay, so I'm on to page 6. The town has to decide what fees and application fees would accompany one of these license requests. And I would only caution that we not go higher than what we think the cost would be to perform the town's functions, which include legal fees, consulting fees, things like that. And this provides for a process for establishing what those dollar amounts would be, and it requires the applicant to pay all of those costs as they're accrued over time. They have those dollars in escrow for the town to use that. There's a pretty significant list of site information and maps and an operation plan details that would be required of someone who would be an applicant, with some choices for you to make about how far out you want them, how far what the perimeter of the area they'd have to evaluate around the site would be. They have to gather baseline and background information and data to be used to evaluate impacts that may occur moving forward. There's requirements that we get into, really the rubber hits the road starting on page 12, where we set what the town's minimum standards would be for a mine. And so this is not mine specific, but this is, if you want to come and mine here and get a license, these are the things you need to do. And this is where you start to put in the criteria that are pretty important. Buffer areas. The buffer areas are to be chosen by the town. You'll see just on the bottom of page 12, there's 6 different distances for different types of buffers. I just drafted a similar ordinance for a town in Barron County, and they established a 1,320 or quarter-mile setback from a residence for mining operations. Now, someone might say, why don't we just say 10 miles and then nobody could mine in the town? 1,320 might be pushing it. We can only act within the appropriate authority of the town's police power, but the choices of it's the town's choice what to put in these ordinances. And I think that a quarter mile, certainly we could make some pretty strong arguments that the town has good reason to push back that far. You know, it's a choice you have to make. We have a license, we drafted a licensing ordinance for the town of Howard in Chippewa County, and they just permitted a mine under that license, and their setback is 800 feet from a residence to the boundary of the mine. And there's a mine that's permitted that's gonna work, and if you look at their map, what they're gonna do, there's big 800-foot circles drawn around all the resident. The setbacks from property lines and roads is 50 feet. And so you're going along the road, and when you get to a residence on the other side, there's a big 800-foot sweep around. And if anybody ever gets a mine permitted in the town we just wrote the ordinance for in Barron County, there's gonna be a lot bigger sweep, right? Some of these things make it virtually impossible for someone to operate a mine. They have to buy an awful lot of land in a ring around it. But as long as the town can justify these under their police power, these provisions, then you make the decision you make. You can see you can build a very welcoming ordinance, or you can build an ordinance that puts up a bit of a stop sign in your town. Hours of operation is no different. I think that you'd be hard pressed to justify under police power having no operations outside of the 9 to 6, let's say, time window, but you can get pretty tight on those hours of operations. Noise levels, you know, I'm, the towns that have tried to put out stop signs, I don't know if this provides comfort to anyone here or to the board members, but the noise levels where people are putting out stop signs to really make minds think twice about coming and applying for a license in their town, they have the same noise limits that's in the Coulee agreement. So, well, at least, I'm sorry, they have the same, the ones we write, 60 is the lowest we've ever gone. That's the nighttime decibel level under the Coulee agreement. 62.5 is the daytime. So you're right in that ballpark as to the stop sign level. The other stop sign level for water quality, for well testing, is a half mile. We've gone out to a mile now on a couple towns that really want to put out a stop sign, but traditionally we've said if you really want to be sure you're being protective when it comes to groundwater moving through sandstone, that's a half mile. You've never seen impacts outside of that. You're far more likely to have a problem with something running on top of the land, not from a sand mine, but from some other use, and then infiltrating and impacting your groundwater than you are to see groundwater move through sandstone more out to a half mile. So in other words, there's a few things that where if you said what's our normal stop sign, I would give you numbers and they would be, and some of them would be consistent with what we've done in the Coulee agreement. There's air pollution requirements. There's air monitoring requirements. There's some of these things are, you know, we've heard people argue. I got to speak carefully in a public meeting. We've heard people argue that those things are things that towns can't do. Maybe they are, maybe they aren't. But if you want to, if that's where you decide to go with your town licensing ordinance, the worst that can happen, as far as I'm concerned, is someone proves you wrong. On that point, the rest of it stays in place. Okay. There's separate air monitoring requirements in the ordinances that we draft for PM10, total particulate, and that those monitors be extra monitors beyond what the DNR requires. Impacts to groundwater quality, I've already talked about that to some degree, but the frequency of testing and the distance out on testing that we would typically require in one of these is very similar to what's in the Coulee mine when I'm advising a town to do what they need to do to keep a mine out. The same down gradient testing and about the same frequency, so very similar. One of the things that would be have a pretty significant impact on future mining operations in this town. Throughout the Chippewa Valley, most of the communities that have licensing ordinances prohibit mining below a certain depth above groundwater. Now, when you drive through the town of Rock, and I came down a new road today, because as I was talking to the chairman, I was getting pulled over by the Wood County Sheriff. Luckily, he was like, well, that means, I said, where are you going so fast? And I said, I gotta get to the town of Rock, and he said, well, you mean the Frac sand mine? He said, get going. First time I've ever used, I'm an attorney and gotten out of anything. But anyway, I came down Falcon Road, and you know, anywhere you go around this town, you know the water level is, I mean, you have some of the best road grades because you have to, the highest road grades because you have to, because the water level is so close to the surface. You know, in Chippewa County, the towns that we've worked with say you can't mine deeper than 10 feet above the water table. I think I'm sitting deep, higher than 10 feet, less than 10 feet above the water table. But point being that you can put in provisions like that, I think we can justify to some extent why we would do that. I think that there's other people who would challenge that, but again, if it's something the town decides to do, that provision alone can be a pretty significant limit on who's going to try to operate under your agreement.
That's a very important point right there.
And you know, in the Chippewa Valley, you've got 300 feet of material before you get to shale, and then the water. And they don't want the shale, so those ordinances are proliferating in that environment. But the groundwater isn't in the resource that the mines are looking for. So it's very different here. So That's one of the things, could you be challenged on that someday? Absolutely. Have people told me that they think that that's absolutely something that the towns can't do? Absolutely. But there's a lot of different pieces in these ordinances, and they don't fall simply because one of these things maybe is impermissible, as, could be proven in a case in another part of the state or something like that. So, there's a lot of reporting in the requirements, management of hazardous materials, inspection, enforcement, procedures and penalties, hearings, remedies. A couple of things that you won't find in this ordinance there's financial assurance and insurance requirements. The financial assurance we typically apply to replacement water supply, as we did in the Coulee approved agreement, and also for road impacts. This ordinance requires there to be a road use agreement, which we didn't have to do in this case. Very, very similar provisions to what has to be provided in terms of an alternative water supply and that sort of thing. So the things you don't find in here that we typically do talk about are royalties and property value guarantees. And that is because of all the things that you could put, we can put them in here, but of all the things that you can put in here that are probably the most likely to be unenforceable, it would be those. Towns have very, very limited ability to tax. You've got to stay in the lanes you can stay in, and a royalty fee is a severance tax, if you will. And so if not by agreement with a mine, that's not something that I recommend putting in your ordinance. Again, if you want to put it in there and it's not enforceable, it shouldn't impact the rest of what's in there. However, one thing to keep in mind is the degree to which you put a target on your back. And I can tell you that politically, at least at the state level, those two issues are the things people are looking for. If you do that, somebody's going to call you a bad actor, and that can change the political winds too, in terms of overall town power. So that's something to think about when you think about how stringent you want to make this kind of an ordinance. So again, to recap, as you look through all these, we've got to fill in all these blanks if you want to create one of these ordinances. If you, I'll push back or explain why maybe some of those numbers are too high or too low. If we're pushing too far, we do need to stay within the appropriate police power, exercise of the police power in the town. But to put it back into the big picture, eventually, ideally what you would have is a town zoning ordinance that didn't say you can have a sand mine anywhere where you can get a conditional use permit. It would instead say, I'm sorry, not a sand mine, a non-metallic mine, because this is your quarries too. It would instead say, we're going to create as a town a non-metallic mining district. And we're going to place that district on all of the non-metallic mines in the town and nowhere else. That's your best place to be. If you want if you would like to have the discretion that some of the people that we've talked to and some of the people in the room would like the town to have, that's the way you get there. You make somebody come to you and say, we want to change our zoning from rural residential or whatever it happens to be, or ag exclusive or whatever. We want to change our zoning from that to non-metallic mining. Because if you make someone ask that question of you, the town can say no, and they don't have to give a reason. It can be based on how the five of you or whoever are in your seats at that time feel about the question. There's no limits. The burden is on the applicant to convince the town board to make that change. Okay? That is not the circumstance you're in now. The circumstance you're in now is a conditional use permit can be granted anywhere in the town, subject to the ordinance, which has a lot of holes in it. And as a result, we're subject to the state law, applicable to conditional use permits, which again, as I said in the beginning of this portion of the meeting, very significantly restricts the town's discretion. It specifically says it can't be based, decisions can't be based on things like whether we want it or what our personal preferences are. It specifically says it can't be based on that. And it specifically says it must be based on the kinds of criteria that we don't have in our ordinance, and that those criteria must be in the ordinance. So work has to be done in this town regardless of how you feel about sand mining, regardless of how open for business for sand mining or rock quarrying or anything else you'd like the town to be. Changes are necessary to accomplish whatever your intent might be. That will be a very difficult discussion. How hard to go with that zoning ordinance, and then when you open up your zoning ordinance, you're looking at everything else, every other use. What about large farms, CAFOs? What about other kinds of businesses and things like that? So what you have as an option is to take an initial step to layer an additional layer of town regulatory authority over your existing zoning ordinance so that you can have time.
That was my question, does that supersede then our zone?
You'd still need a conditional use permit. But I think that what you'd probably do, somebody'd have to get both. But you have the ability here to set standards that right now you can't set. If somebody wasn't willing to go into the operator agreement discussion, and now that I'm not afraid to say this, now that the town board has made its decision on this agreement, we had no authority to require Coulee to enter into the agreement that has now been passed by the town. We couldn't require them to go that route. And they did so voluntarily. We had very little leverage. They did so voluntarily. And the protections that are in that document compared to what we could have just imposed as a matter of police power under zoning conditions, not even comparable. So you find yourself in a situation legally and you do the best you can with it. And that doesn't mean you stop once you deal with that situation. And so as a community, you have to decide how you want to move forward.
So what do you want to do with this, Pete? Do you want to schedule another time, sit down with Larry and go
Yes,
over
definitely. I mean, that has to be, this is something that definitely needs to get taken care of.
We as a board, can
Support it as soon as possible.
we as a board adopt this, or do we have to?
Just as a board, we'll put it on, if you're ready to go with those blanks, we can put it on your next meeting, or your next regular meeting, and you can make a vote and it's done. No, there's no advance notice, there's no additional publication requirements or anything like that. It's just adopted as would be any other ordinance, cemetery ordinance, anything else.
So we'd still have to, in the future, like you were saying, if another mining company came in, they would still have to go through all the county permitting and.
That's correct.
And all of that, the additional use.
But this,
We'd have to agree to a conditional use, but they would also have to
well,
follow
and
these guidelines and get a license.
yeah, and I wouldn't say we'd have to agree to a conditional use, but if you had an applicant that wanted to push the issue and not attempt to find a way to yes that would be more agreeable to the town, they could take a much harder position with you on the existing zoning ordinance.
Oh, yeah.
So I would plan for that, because it makes for good decision-making on this. If you plan for that, expecting that's what would happen next time, then really what becomes important is what you do with this, until you get that changed, okay? So, if you had someone come in and people actually thought it was a good project and you wanted to approve it, it would probably look very much like what was voted on earlier. But you gotta create, right now you gotta create a little more leverage, is I guess my position.
Yeah, this is really the detailed requirements that the town has that should
That
have
are right
been-
out there.
That it should have been in the
Anybody-
zoning, right? We should have measurable requirements in the zoning.
I
as
think
pertaining to
you're
that.
right, but also because of the conditional use permit limitations, all advice I'm giving to towns around the state right now is you need to move away from conditional use permits. And because the legislature took some of your authority, an important chunk of your authority, basically your discretion. They took it away on conditional use permits. And not to make anybody scared, but after this long, I say our zoning ordinance in this town says, if there's anything you wanna do, you gotta get a conditional use permit. If you're in, a secondary conservation area, of which the vast majority of the town is, if not the entire town. And so, any use is a conditional use permit. So not only are you not backed away from conditional use permits, you're all in on conditional use permits, right? You're exactly the opposite of where I'd like to see you. This only satisfies the issue for non-metallic mining. But the limitations on the town zoning ordinance that I've expressed tonight apply to every other kind of use that could come in here, right? And use your imagination, because it gets a whole lot hairier than what we've dealt with in the last 6 months. So there's a real need to reevaluate the whole structure of how this town is regulating land use. And this is just the first step for non-metallic mining. And it shouldn't put anybody in a position where they feel that between this and the zoning ordinance, this town's got its hands around managing how land use decisions will be made in the future, because that's absolutely not true.
So that'll be one of our highest priorities.
Absolutely, priority one. You got it.
So zoning, rezoning takes time. Anytime you make a change to the zoning ordinance, there's notice requirements, there's actual time requirements built in. But you may want to consider multi-pronged approach. One, you all talked to me about this. You want to get something in place so that you can catch your breath on non-metallic mining. Two, you may want to evaluate an initial change to your zoning ordinance just to really reshape the conditional use permit aspect. And then decide how you want to regulate yourself as a community, and go through a planning process with a lot of public involvement about all the different types of uses, and really go through a comprehensive approach. That could take you 2 or 3 years, reasonably.
We can adopt changes to it
You can tweak
incrementally,
anything.
yeah, we can change it.
Right, so you may want to really just focus on how does the fact that we're so reliant on this conditional use permit tool put us at a disadvantage in terms of the town's exercise of discretion on land use, and what tweaks can we make? The ordinance is in a condition right now that it's almost hard to build on, but you might want to do it anyway with respect to just creating more arguments in case, you're not talking necessarily about something that, would be necessary. You might be able to cover your bases with non-metallic mining, but your next door neighbor might sell to somebody who wants to put up
Landfill.
well,
Racetrack, anything.
anything.
Racetrack, anything.
Right, a big waste transfer station or something like that. You're on Highway 10, you're awfully close, there's a lot of things like that would be, and they're likely first to look to your neighbors who are unzoned, because they don't even get to have talks like this. They don't even get to have discussions like this, because they haven't exercised that basic authority. They may look there first, but if there's some strategic reason why they want to be in this town, you could be facing that, so. This Act 67 was the enactment. That's a real wake-up call for a lot of towns on conditional use permits. Towns wanted to not sound too strict, so they said, yeah, we'll just do it under conditional use permit, meaning, well, we'll just deny it piece by piece, and we can't do that anymore, so. At least not in the way that we intended it when this ordinance was written. So that's the big picture of how this would fit into that process. Basically, this could, I'm assuming you'll post this?
Yes.
Post it. We should have a public, you should have a public meeting at which people can come in and say what they think these blanks should be filled in, how they should be filled in. Hopefully they do that within reason, because we don't want all of these things to be, overturnable if somebody was a challenge.
We will have you an advisement for that.
Right, I just mean it. And that can be done, you know, that's something that, you know, you could all as a group without me, you could have a meeting, hear from people as to what blanks, talk as a board, and then talk back to me, send the information back as to what you want to change. I wouldn't even have to be there. Just know that if I was here and somebody says we want wells tested 10 miles away, I would say, unlikely that if someone challenges that in court, that you're gonna, you gotta try not to take advantage of the authority you have in a way that would weaken your position if you were challenged at something. If that makes sense.
And I'm just gonna ask a question about having a non-metallic mining district in the zoning period. Is there a possibility that we could just take that completely out of our zoning, so that's not even an option?
Well, we could take, you wouldn't have to, because you already have some. And you could make those non-conforming, but that doesn't get you anywhere, so you wouldn't even have to. You create that zone, and you apply it to the places where you've got non-metallic mining. You know, the Coulee, the other pit that, well, I don't remember the names, but the places where you've got non-metallic mining, so you wouldn't even have to. The challenge is, if you just say you can't have it, then somebody can come in and say, well, that's not an appropriate zoning ordinance, but you could instead answer, we do have it, and we've got enough of it. Okay? And if you say there's 27 spots, maybe not all of which you put in there, maybe they've been defunct for long enough that you wouldn't want to have that be somewhere they could keep going. But if you have 10 spots in the town, I'd feel pretty confident in any kind of challenge that would come on that. So you can put yourself in a better position to withstand a challenge by just going with the status quo.
Right.
And actually, that's what, I think, if it wasn't for a licensing ordinance, I would say that would, given what all of your instructions to me have been, I would say, right away, create that zone, apply it to the existing mines and the approved mines. But I think you're gonna be okay here.
Yeah.
And then, and this can be done much faster. But it's all the other uses that I'd be concerned about, and I know I'm speaking kind of strongly about this, but I think there should be a sense of urgency in this town about reviewing the degree to which conditional use permits are accessible at this point to people.
So, any other questions of Larry on this? Kick it around, go through it.
And then I guess the next step is to schedule a meeting where everybody will have a chance to read through it and
Look through it, yeah, exactly.
hear from the public about
Yep.
what should be in those ranks. I just have you posted just like that.
Post it on the
The
website.
the things that I,
Presented.
sorry.
No, go ahead.
The things that I've highlighted here are just some of the things, everything in here is open to discussion, right?
Right.
So I think there's some real obvious things that setback distances. One of the things I didn't highlight in here, is a requirement that all sand piles be enclosed. Now, if you have somebody who
Oh, you
wants.
did put that in there.
I put that in here.
Yeah, you did say that.
Yep.
Yep.
And and so there's things like that where I feel like I could justify this, but that's the kind of thing that is cost prohibitive for most places. You have a mine now in I think Chippewa County that just accepted those terms, but at some point, if you put enough terms on and they accept it, well then you've put enough terms on to make sure you're not gonna be impacted. I mean,
Right.
the dust concerns, if you have a dry plant where you really have your dust concerns, again, for everyone, the Coulee mine does not have an approved dry plant. But if you did, if somebody comes in and wants to do that and you have a full enclosure of these piles, it is, you'd be like cardboard You know, I mean,
Right.
you'd be like them. They manage their dust because they're bringing stuff in and they're bringing it, they're really enclosing it. And that's why when you go tour there, you know, that's something they can manage in terms of, it's not out in the weather, it's clean.
What do you think? Anybody have any other questions of Larry on this?
You know, they're all here.
About,
I haven't had a chance to look at it.
No, I mean,
Right,
but
right.
it's up to you.
it's, you know, I mean, it's brand new. We've just received it, you know, Larry went through it a little bit. I mean, you know, we'll post it on the website. Does anybody have any questions of anything that he presented, you know, as far as this new, you know, is it, it's, I mean, the board, like you stated, the board has been, we've been diligent and we've talked to, we've heard all of the citizens stating that we need something. And we're definitely, you know, this is something that we've worked on and going through in the final draft. Well, not the final draft, but I mean, the draft is here now, so as I said, Greg will put it on the website, and this is priority one for the board, guaranteed, there's no doubt. And, that's, so.
I have a question. You mentioned,
Excuse me, yes?
yeah, Melanie Carter from 9502 Fairhaven. You mentioned the move, or strategic move away from conditional use permits. What's the alternative, just building it into the zoning ordinance?
That's right. You know, basically what a lot of communities have done over the years, and this community definitely did, is you just punt those decisions into the conditional use permit category. And that's what was done here. There's, the only thing that's mentioned in your zoning ordinance, basically, the only land use that's really specifically mentioned is non-metallic mining. And so everything else is sort of punted into this conditional use permit category. So what you do is, you both specify what you're going to allow and what you're not gonna allow with these uses. Perfect example is, adult bookstores, novelty, right? So communities that don't have those ordinances, that's where they get stuck, right? And so we don't have anything in the town of Rock zoning ordinance on that. So if somebody wanted to put one of those next to you, they'd come to the town to get a conditional use permit. And we don't have any standards in our ordinance about how and to what extent we would or wouldn't permit one of those. And as a result, it's really hard to meet the statutory requirements as a town about whether you could say no to that, right? And so the alternative is to say, build actual zones and actual criteria for particular uses. But what I mean by actual zones is basically what we've got now is the whole town is the same zone. And so we say we're zoned, but we're not really zoned. We'll let you know if you can do what you want to do when you ask us. When that was okay with conditional use permits, it was fine, but it's not anymore. So what you do is you say, we're gonna have a residential zone, we're gonna have a commercial zone, you know, maybe that's up along Highway 10, we're gonna have, does the town go up to 10?
Yes.
Yeah. Maybe we're gonna have some light industrial areas, and we can apply that either in the sand mining context or not. And we talk about the particular uses that we would allow and that we wouldn't allow, and by listing those under state law, it means the other things are not allowed. And if anybody wants to come in and do anything that's not allowed, they would then have to get a zoning change. Again, that's a change to the ordinance. Town has full discretion as to whether to issue that. And until the next enactment of the legislature, but as of now, we have full discretion on that. And so you can fully control what uses. There's some exceptions. Livestock sighting for large animal agriculture is a significant exception. That's a specific land use that has been preempted. For the most part, you can get into the business of regulating it, but you have very little control. So that's the next thing that I would want you to think about, though, is livestock sighting.
questions on this set?
Looks good. Sooner we can do it.
The sooner we can do it, sooner we can get it taken care of.
And you don't have to worry about scheduling me, like I said, have a meeting when everybody in the public's had a chance to review this. You know, do it, make sure there's enough time to review, but don't waste time, and then, fill in these blanks, and the next meeting, you,
Sure. Sounds good. Anyone?
I just want to speak up and say thanks to Larry for everything he's done. I mean, it would have been horrible without you.
thank you.
Absolutely, absolutely.
You devised this, you know, appropriately and helped us with our, you know, with giving your legal advice as far as what we can and can't do and going forward. So, appreciate that.
Thank you. So, alright, at this point, I guess I will entertain a motion to adjourn the meeting.
Go ahead, you can make the first.
Motion by Lewis. Motion by Lewis, second by John, by John's Rudka to adjourn the meeting. Any further discussion? All those in favor signify by saying aye.
Aye.
Opposed? Motion carries. Thank you, everyone. This meeting is now adjourned.